Unit 4, Political Geography, will cover chapters 7 and 8. Before you finish reading chapter 7, key issue 1, take a look at the map at the beginning of the chapter and try to familiarize yourself with the areas that are covered in chapter 7. And so we'll be talking about ethnic distribution in the United States. We'll talk about Quebec. We'll be talking about areas in Russia like Kiev. We'll be talking about Lebanon, Baghdad and Iraq, the former Yugoslavia, South Africa, Sudan and South Sudan, other ethnic problems with the Horn of Africa, Sri Lanka, and Kashmir. So make sure you know where these locations are. Chapter 7, Key Issue 1, deals with where are ethnicities distributed, primarily in the United States. So the first part of Chapter 7, Key Issue 1 will identify and describe the major ethnicities in the United States, and it will also differentiate between ethnicity and race. And Chapter 7, Key Issue 1 will also talk about the distribution of major U.S. ethnicities among states and within urban areas. So ethnicity is an identity with a group of people who share cultural traditions from a particular homeland or hearth. So ethnicity has to do with really like what country is was your family from? Like what cultural practices from that nation or that state do you identify with? And race is an identity with a group of people who share a biological ancestry. So ethnicity has to do with cultural practices. And when we refer to race, we're really talking about that small percent of DNA that determines usually your skin color. And like we talked about in class, we know that race, the genetics that make up your race are very, very, very tiny. And really only changes your skin color and maybe some other minor like outside phenotypical traits, but doesn't change your capacity to learn or anything like that. So the human race is more alike than different. In geography, we look at the distribution of persons of color in the United States and in some other nations. And we do that because we know that even though race doesn't really make us biologically that different, we do know that race, as it's viewed socially and culturally, can make a huge difference. It can determine where you live in a city, where you're able to buy a home in the city, even though it shouldn't anymore. It certainly did historically. Where were people able to purchase homes? Where were they able to go to school? What areas do you spend your leisure time in? And so we know that the distribution of ethnicity and race within a country can determine a great deal about a person's life. We keep track of the different races and ethnicities in the United States by using the Census Bureau. So every 10 years, the Census Bureau collects, really conducts like a survey of the population. And we look at 3 ethnicities in our Census Bureau. So we ask people to identify if they are from Asian American. So if your ancestry, if your family came from anywhere in Asia, you would be Asian American. We look at African Americans, so people who identify with a group of cultural traditions from people in Africa, and then Hispanic. And so we look at Americans who are from Spanish-speaking countries. And so we are a multi-ethnic, multinational state. So our country has multiple ethnicities and more than one nation, like we'll talk about in Chapter 8. So if you look at your textbook uses President Barack Obama as an example. His mother was from Kansas. She was a white woman at this university in Hawaii, where she met former President Barack Obama's father, who was at the University of Hawaii also on a scholarship. He was from Kenya. So they met and married in Hawaii. That's where President Obama was born. And when they later divorced, his mother then married a man from Indonesia who was in school in the United States on a scholarship. President Barack Obama actually spent a few years in Indonesia, in Jakarta. And then he has a half-sister who would be part Caucasian and part Indonesian. So he once said that his family was like a mini United Nations, which I think is pretty cool. And this right here, Barack Obama's family, is really indicative of what many families look like in our part of the country, because we live in South Florida, which is a really ethnically and racially diverse part of the country. And so this family here doesn't seem strange to us, right? Because you probably know people who come from families of many different races or many different ethnicities. Maybe they didn't move to Indonesia for a few years, but you probably know people whose families don't look this different. My family can certainly look this way at times. So for people who live in an area of the country like us, this is a normal family. But we have different distributions of ethnicities within the United States. So there's ethnic groups that live in particular regions and particular communities within states and within the whole country and within a city. So if we look at a regional scale, Hispanics are primarily clustered in the Southwest. That doesn't mean we don't have Hispanic people all over this country, and we certainly have a great deal of Hispanic people living in, South Florida where we live. And there's another cluster in, like the Chicagoland area where I grew up, and another cluster up near New York, right? But if you were looking at the largest distribution of Hispanic Americans, they would be in the Southwest. I'm not sure if on the census, I think that the census, the classifications aren't perfect, and so I think they would classify if you were Brazilian in with Hispanics, even though Hispanic means Spanish-speaking, and people from Brazil speak Portuguese, and so it probably should be Latino or Latina, but, just a quirk of our census system, not really updated. And then African Americans, we have a large cluster of African Americans, the largest in the southeast of the United States. But clearly, African Americans live all throughout of our country, and there's other large distributions in the Chicagoland area, in New York, and of course in the California area. And then Asian Americans are primarily clustered in the West. And again, Asian Americans are distributed throughout the entire country, but we're looking at where do you find the largest population. So if you look at the percent Hispanic or Latino, you can see that the largest clusters are in the Southwest of the United States. But there are, of course, clusters throughout parts of the country. So South Florida, where we live, has a large cluster of Hispanic Americans, which shouldn't come as a surprise to you. Also, Puerto Rico, clearly. Chicago has another large cluster. The Manhattan area, the New York area in the Northeast. And then up here in the Washington and Oregon area. If we're looking at the largest percent groups of African Americans, the largest group is still here in the southeastern part of the United States. So you're looking right across here, an area that we can usually identify as the South or the Bible Belt, with large clusters in South Florida, large clusters in northern Indiana, in the Gary area. And then if you look at the percent of Asian Americans and how they're distributed across the country, the largest cluster would be in Hawaii and then in California. But of course, Asian Americans can live all over the country. Ethnic groups might live in these particular regions or particular communities within cities or states. So we've looked at regionally where people are distributed throughout the United States. And we'll talk about historic migration patterns in Key Issue 2 and why those patterns exist. But at an urban scale, African Americans and Hispanics are largely clustered in urban environments. That doesn't mean that African Americans and Hispanics only live in urban areas. There's large clusters in urban areas like Chicago. So there are neighborhoods in the south and west side of Chicago that have extensive African American clusters, and same in Los Angeles. African Americans have a large population in south central LA. Hispanics in East LA, and then there's a large Asian American population in South and West LA. So if you look at Chicago, you can see this area here is where at least 50% of the population in Chicago, the south side of Chicago, is African American, and then you've got some areas in western Chicago right here. You've got a smaller region, a smaller ethnic cluster of Asian Americans right here. And then you have large clusters of Hispanic or Latino or Latina populations distributed throughout Chicago as well. And then you have large populations that are more than 50% white throughout Chicago as well. And then here, these gray areas, these are areas where there is no predominant ethnicity. So there's no 50% majority in that place. It's just, an ethnically mixed community. And then if you look here in LA, you get the same thing. You get large clusters of Hispanic or Latino Americans. You have a cluster right here of African American, and same right here. You have a large cluster of Asian Americans. Again, here, this kind of grayish area is where there is no ethnicity that makes up 50% or more of the population. And then these areas in LA are predominantly white. And that's about it for Chapter 7, Key Issue 1.